Storyteller's Thread, a monthly podcast devoted to young adult literature and the art of storytelling. I'm your host, Sean Connors. On each episode, we invite an author for young adults to take us inside their work, and in doing so, to talk about their writing process, their inspiration for writing for young readers, and the general ins and outs of earning a living as a professional storyteller. So, whether you're a compulsive reader, an aspiring writer, a teacher or librarian, or simply a frustrated reader who's counting the hours until you get home and dive back into that novel that's waiting for you on your nightstand, this is the place for you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Storyteller's Thread podcast. It's November 1st, 2018, and this month we're talking with Kenneth Oppel, the Canadian writer and author of nearly 30 books for children and young adults, including the Silverwing trilogy, Airborne, The Boundless, Half-Brother, The Stark Endeavor. Ken's one of my favorite children's writers, and I can't tell you how much I enjoyed talking with him. I think you're really going to enjoy this month's episode. If you're a fan of children's and young adult literature, or if you aspire to write for these audiences, I think you're going to appreciate the insights that Ken has to share about his writing process and also about the work of earning a living as a professional writer. Speaking of audiences, before we get started, I want to thank all of you who tuned into this program last month. Your support and your words of encouragement are really appreciated. I'd also like to recruit your help. If you enjoy the Storyteller's Thread podcast, and if you feel like you have something positive you can say about it, please take a minute to look the program up on iTunes and rate it. It'll only take a few seconds out of your life, but you'll be helping me tremendously. Feel free to share your thoughts about the program in the comments section as well. Even if you don't rate the show, no worries. Just promise me you'll tell a friend, just one person about it, or help spread the word via social media. I've scheduled interviews in the months to come with some truly outstanding writers for children and young adults, people I think you're going to be excited about, and I'm committed to finding an audience for this program, but I can't do that without your help. There, that's the end of my shameless plug. Thanks as always for listening to this podcast, and I hope you enjoy this month's episode of the Storyteller's Thread. When he was 14, Kenneth Oppel wrote a 50-page story about a young boy who is surprised to learn that the characters in a popular video game he enjoys playing have come to life. Oppel submitted the story to Canadian publishers, all of whom politely declined it. Undismayed, he revised the story the following summer, and this time experienced a stroke of luck. A friend of the family volunteered to share his manuscript with Roald Dahl, who was impressed enough with it to pass it on to his literary agent, who in turn signed Oppel as a client. In 1985, at 18, Oppel published his first novel under the title Colin's Fantastic Video Adventure. Today, having published close to 30 novels and picture books for children and young adults, Oppel is among Canada's most recognizable authors for children. His popular Silverwing trilogy, which tells the story of a young bat eager to fly in the light of day, has sold over 1 million copies worldwide. Airborne, a work of steampunk fiction for middle grade readers, was selected as a Michael Prins Honor Book by the American Library Association in 2004 and earned Canada's prestigious Governor General's Award for Children's Literature in the same year. His novel Half-Brother, which was inspired by a real-life experiment in which scientists sought to understand whether chimpanzee could be taught language, earned the Canadian Library Association's Book of the Year for Children Award, as well as its Young Adult Book Award, making Oppel the first author in the award's history to earn both honors. The New York Journal of Books has described Oppel as an expert storyteller and outstanding world builder. And the Times Colonist, a Canadian newspaper, has praised his ability to create complex characters, bad and good, who are convincing, involving, sometimes funny, and always easy to cheer on. Today, Oppel lives in Toronto with his wife and children, where he continues to write books for children and teenagers. In fall 2018, he embarked on a multi-country speaking tour to promote his newest novel, Inkling, which is scheduled for release in U.S. bookstores in early November. Despite his busy traveling schedule, Oppel made time to sit down with me to talk about his work, changes he's observed in the children's book market over the course of his career, and his commitment to writing books for children and teenagers that invite them to lose themselves in fantastical story worlds, much as he enjoyed doing as a child. So you were born in Port Alberni, which is a small town on Vancouver Island, British Columbia, but you spent the majority of your childhood in Victoria, British Columbia, and I believe later on the east coast of Canada in Halifax.
Yeah.
What was that experience of moving between places as a child like for you?
As a kid, I resented it, of course. I mean, I was resistant to the move to Halifax because, all my friends were in Victoria, and I liked Victoria. And I think kids are probably naturally conservative when it comes to big life changes. But after a couple of years in Halifax, I fell in love with Halifax. I had a great new set of friends, and one of the best schools I'd ever gone to as a kid. We had some family. My mom's family was from the East Coast, so we got to meet a whole new side of the family. So the 4 years we spent there really were kind of some of the best years of my childhood, I think. Certainly in retrospect, part of that might just have been the age, sort of 7 to 11, or was it a little older, 8 to 10? Also, I saw the first Star Wars movie there and the second Star Wars movie there, and those are formative experiences. That goes a long way to ease a move. And then moving back, it was weird because it was sort of like starting all over again with the group of friends I left behind. And we'd all sort of grown apart and become quite different people. So then I was actually at a different school when I got back to the West Coast and formed a whole new set of friends at a different school.
Were you moving for your parents' work?
Well, I was moving. My dad decided to go back to school later in life. So he'd done his undergrad in Victoria, and then he went to law school in Halifax. And so that's why we moved out to the East Coast. And then most of our family was back on the West Coast. And the plan was always, I think, to go back to Victoria. So that's what we did.
When you look back on your childhood, what memories do you have of storytelling?
Our house was a very book-friendly place. We had a lot of books. My parents read to us, which I really enjoyed. We read a lot of things aloud. I remember Lord of the Rings, and every Christmas we'd read Dylan Thomas's that famous Dylan Thomas poem about Christmas that I'm blanking on the title now. So we did read a lot aloud, and trips to the library were a regular part of my childhood, and the bookstores. Getting books was a common gift in our household, birthdays and Christmases. And early on, I sort of liked just sort of writing my own stories at school, and then increasingly just in my own time.
I was going to ask you, when did you first know that you were going to be a writer?
Yeah, I guess around 13, I remember articulating it to my parents. But even before then, creative writing was something I did really with enjoyment at school. And then, as I said, more and more in my own time, it sort of became my hobby. And the stories just got longer and longer. And they were essentially, when I look back on it now, fan fiction. I was writing Star Wars type stories because I loved Star Wars. And then I played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons. And so I wrote sort of really just extensions of the game, fictionalized extensions, sword and sorcery stories. And then when I got into video games, I started a story about a kid who was addicted to video games. And that ended up, after several years and revisions, becoming my first published book.
And that's Colin's Fantastic Video Adventure.
That's it.
You started that book when you were very young.
Yeah, 14, I think.
And you did a revision of it, and it was eventually published when you were around 18 years old in 1985.
That's right. Yeah, I just turned 18.
How did you come to write that particular book?
Well, like my earlier writing, it really was a form of fan fiction. I was in love with this early, what I'll now call a vintage Atari game called Asteroids. And it's like, when I show it to kids, they think, why is he showing us a picture of his refrigerator? But it was, I played it a lot, in video arcades and loved it. And so naturally, I just wanted to think about it all the time. So writing a story about a kid like me who played a lot of a game like that was highly enjoyable to me. And it was a very fanciful story about a boy who discovers two little space pilots who actually live in another world on the other side of the screen, in which everything he sees is actually happening. And the two space pilots defect. They're tired of getting smashed by asteroids, and they jump through the screen and land in his pocket and make friends with him and teach him and help him win all sorts of video game competitions. So it was very much written in the style of Roald Dahl. I mean, really, it was a fan fiction in a way of Roald Dahl, in that I was mimicking his style because I thought he was the best. And I typed it up very carefully, my story of about 50 pages in the summer holidays when I was 14, and sent it out to a whole bunch of publishers in Canada, and they all rejected it, some with encouraging letters, I think aware of my tender years. And then I was disappointed, but I decided to have another go at it. And so the next summer I rewrote it, and it grew to 100 pages, and it was a lot better. And that's when I got my really lucky break as a writer, because my father was working with someone who knew Roald Dahl from his childhood in England, and was going to visit Roald Dahl, and he offered to show Roald Dahl my manuscript. And Dahl was good enough to, cast an eye over it at least, and see some spark or promise. And he showed it to his literary agent, and they took me on as a client, and very quickly sold it to Puffin Books in the UK and Dutton in the US. So that was my huge lucky break as a writer, and launched my career.
I'm trying to imagine what it's like at 18 or 19 years old to land your own literary agent and publisher.
It was amazing. I was so excited and so encouraged too that this was something I might be able to continue to do as a career, and my hope was to make a living at it too, and just be able to write full time.
Was there a sense of trepidation at that point of, can I do this again?
A little bit, but there was so much youthful sort of confidence and arrogance too. Also, I was buffered by university, because I was just about to leave for a 4-year undergrad degree at University of Toronto. So I knew that was something I was going to have in my sort of arsenal as well. Although I think the idea initially was, yes, I'd get an English degree and maybe become a professor and write on the spare time in a very sort of Dawnish English way like C.S. Lewis, and have a pipe and wear tweed and stuff. But that fell apart pretty quickly after second year. I knew that I didn't really want to be an academic. I just wanted to write full time. And you continued to write as a college student. I did. I'd started a second book and finished the second book just as I was actually entering university, and none of my publishers wanted it. They didn't think it was a very strong book. So that was a taste of rejection I hadn't had yet. So I sort of shelved that one. Tried a couple others that never really took off, and didn't really finish another full-length book until my 4th year, when I actually took an independent studies course as one of my English courses, and got credit for writing a first draft of a new children's book. And that one did go on to get published the following year by a Canadian house. So I had a new set of publishers for that one. And that was really, that was starting to be sort of the first book that I was writing in my own voice. The first book really was me apprenticing virtually with Roald Dahl. And the next book was, more my own, the beginnings of my own voice. I'm really struck by the fact that you started writing for children or young readers right out of the gate with your first book, and you've continued that over the course of your career. What motivates you to write for children and teenagers? I think a lot of it is the type of stories that I enjoyed when I was in that age range. They gave me such enjoyment and such a sense of excitement and adventure, and also comfort. And it seemed natural, certainly when I was starting, I was still a kid myself, that I would write about the things of childhood. But as I got older, I still wanted to write about those things. I think the people who end up writing for kids just really are interested in childhood and the things that kids go through, and the kind of first experiences. They're very sort of potent experiences because they are first-time experience. Testing boundaries, new emotions, and as similarly as readers, you're writing for kids who are reading these narratives, these kind of narratives for the first time. So you're really sort of getting in there, in their literary sort of infancy, which is quite, I think, quite powerful. But for me, I think the kind of ideas I have are fantastical ideas a lot of the time, and they seem to fit best with a younger audience, who are just sort of more open and more still in that realm of of the possible and the wonderful. Certainly, in the way that the stories I read were.
And I believe you wrote a novel for adults.
I did.
Published in around 2000, 2001, and went back to writing for children and have continued to do so since. Do you have any desire to write for adults, or are you truly content staying in the children's and teenage market?
I'm mostly content to stay where I am. Occasionally I do have ideas, or maybe really just one or two ideas for adult books. As I get older, I mean, obviously I've spent more of my life as an adult than a child. So I have a lot of, what I think is, interesting, or, at least it's interesting to me as an adult material to contribute. Although I guess I'm sort of held back by several factors. One is it would be like starting all over again. And I've written so long for a younger audience and honed my skills for a certain kind of storytelling that I think it'd be quite a wrench to sort of start writing for a different audience. I don't know. Also, I kind of worry that the kind of things that I'd write about as an adult would be the kind of things that 99% of literary authors are writing about, which is usually, I don't know, encroaching middle age and disappointment and the realization that life is a mess and we're just all thrashing around in the muck. And it doesn't seem to me like super original or I don't know, nourishing kind of material. Whereas I know I can write a rollicking adventure story for kids that it will at least give them a huge amount of pleasure, I hope, and fun. That seems to me a little more I don't know, just a little more worthwhile somehow.
Well, you commented on the fact that you've been writing for a number of years now as an adult, and books for young readers are generally written by adults, meaning that the representations of a young person's experience that are filtered through the lens of an adult perspective. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious, is that something that you're cognizant of as a writer?
I think as you get older, you're more aware of the growing canyon between your adult self and your childhood self. And that does become an issue that you run the risk, I think, and some writers do, you can see it in their prose, of starting to write nostalgia. And I think kids can kind of sniff out nostalgia, because I think what distinguishes people who write specifically for children as opposed to adult writers who have child characters in their books, and there are many of them, is that lack, as you said, of editorialization, of reflection, of framing, and sort of recontextualizing from an adult point of view. The trick to writing for kids successfully, I think, is it's all in the now. You have to be in their skin, experiencing things in real time. There's no clever or wise framing of their experiences. You're just in it, in the present tense, when you're writing, I think, for kids properly. So I think that's the trick. And I think the people who can do it well are people for whom childhood isn't this thing you sort of leave behind as you age, but childhood sort of travels with you through your life. It's like a parallel stream. And the people who are good at writing for kids are dipping back into that stream more easily than others might. I think there's a lot of people, and I've met lots of people in my life who are very eager to leave their childhood behind like something shameful. But like it or not, I think childhood is, probably the single most important stage in everyone's life, like it or not. And, the sadnesses and excitements and traumas or neglects that we suffer in childhood are going to form us and be with us our whole lives.
You talked about the importance of, when writing for children, being in their skin in the present. Mm-hmm. I'm curious, could you say a little more about that? What you mean by that?
I just mean trying to be as honest as possible about, what a child would really think and experience in moments of crisis or excitement or, happiness. It's very hard because, as you said, it's impossible for an adult to write without the temptation to impose a more mature sensibility or a more adult sensibility on his young protagonist. And I think a certain amount of that will always creep in. I think if you look at the body of children's literature, these kids tend to be unusually perceptive.
Right.
And clever, and their dialogue tends to be pretty erudite, for the average 8 or 10 or 12 or 16-year-old. I think it was John Green who said, "My characters talk the way teens wished they talked," and I think there's a lot of truth in that. Being written by adults, we tend to sort of, smarten our kids up. So that is the challenge of writing, because you are trying to be honest. So, a lot of the times, kids would say or do dumb things or ill-considered things or rash things. And I think it's important to remember that when you write. I mean, what further compounds the trouble is that, our books are also reviewed and juried and debated and ultimately chosen by adults in the publishing industry. And depending on their their ability to understand these books really are written for kids. They're not written for the adults, The adults are the gatekeepers, but they are written for children. And I think a lot of the time, different adult agendas, more now than ever, get imposed on children's books. And they're seen as, social engineering tools or political platforms. And I think what gets lost is, the childhood in the book, possibly.
How do you experience that as a writer when you do see either educators or people on the awards committee, when they do tend to treat your books as means to an end other than maybe what you intend them?
It makes me sad in many ways, because over the years I've seen books are seen less as works of literature than, as I said, teaching platforms for whatever agenda or chorus. I feel that books are a generous medium. They can contain multitudes, and the best books both delight and instruct. And those are masterpieces, really, if they can be both. But the pleasure principle is still, I think, strong and perhaps the most important principle in literature, especially for kids. And I think in recent years, books have just been reduced to a checklist of what issues this addresses, how can I teach this in the classroom, who's being represented in this book. And it's not to say that all these initiatives aren't worthy. They certainly are. But I sometimes do worry that we forget about the craft in the book and the literature of the book, and we just concentrate too much on the content or the politics of the book.
I was thinking, I teach a course on young adult literature, and we recently read a book, I won't name it, but one of the criticisms for the students was it's not saying anything profound. It's fun to read. It's not saying anything profound. And I asked them, is it okay for a book to just be enjoyable? Mm-hmm. And it was interesting because they really seemed to struggle with that. Mm-hmm. It was like they were so indoctrinated in this idea that, as you're saying, that there has to be a sort of checklist to make the book worthy of teaching it. Mm-hmm. But I agree with you. It does seem like just the pleasure of losing yourself in a story does seem to be getting overlooked.
It's very much of the moment, and I think it will change and evolve as all things do. I just think right now we're in a very content intensive period of literature, and I think right now I think maybe craft or skill, certainly pleasure or fun is going to take a distant backseat to content and an agenda for the short term anyway.
Yeah. If my math's correct, you've been writing for young readers for more than 33 years, or certainly more than half of your life.
I have, yeah.
In that time, how have you seen the marketplace for children's and young adult literature change?
Hugely. I mean, just in terms of the fads and the trends. I mean, I sort of, my books were starting to be published when, oh gosh, I mean, huge phenomena like the Babysitters Club or Goosebumps were the reigning champions of children's literature, and then really, I mean, the next great phase was the fantasy phase that was probably kicked off by Harry Potter, and that really launched a huge revival of the fantasy genre for kids. And prior to that, I think it seemed to me most of the emphasis was on naturalistic novels, so-called problem novels, more domestically centered or school-centered novels. And then suddenly, wow, the Harry Potter, we had a decade of just fantasy from mad magicians to sword and sorcery fantasy surging back, and also with these big blockbuster books, I think, both good and bad effects. I mean, the good effect was there's a lot more heat and attention focused on children's literature, because really for the first time adults were starting, to pay attention, mostly just because of the huge cultural phenomenon of Harry Potter, but also, and this has some negative results, just the fiscal consideration that, there was a buck to be made in this game. And I think once that happens, then everyone's ears perk up and you're looking for the next sort of copycat thing. And the book business, I think, really over the last 25 years or so has started to become a lot more like the movie business, with publishers really, they're paying a lot of money a lot of the time for what they think of as the next Harry Potter. And then it was the next Twilight. And then it was the next Hunger Games. And then it was the next John Green. And there's just a lot more sort of chasing after things, I think, at the expense of just publishing, books that were a bit different and would stand, might stand on their own just for their own for their own merits, rather than being likened to something else. So, I mean, that's a big change, and I guess the growth of the YA market would be the other big change. I mean, when I started out, YA you would have been nuts to write a YA book, because there wasn't any readership for books written for like sort of 16, 17-year-olds. The expectation was when you were done reading so-called middle grade books, you would just go on and read, books for grown-ups, as I did as a kid. You sort of, after 12, your reading just explodes all over the place, from like Stephen King to, John Grisham to George Orwell to Hemingway to John Updike to, the whole universe of adult literature. But with the success of all these, teen books, this whole new market was created, and really just for a long time dominated really all the attention in the children's book industry. So those are some of the big changes. And right now, we touched on earlier, I feel like the partly it's just the fraught political times we're living through. I think there's just much more activism and a sense of social justice that's really taken over in literature. It's like writers have just felt this need to make a difference politically in their books, in a focused and concerted way in which I don't think they used to even 20 years ago. So I think that is very much the trend of the moment.
So I'm curious, what are some of the changes that you've described? What do they mean for you as a writer? For example, you've talked about the fact that children's literature and young literature has become very much trend-driven. So do you feel that pressure as a writer?
I feel like I've been kind of lucky, because, I mean, certainly I sort of, at times I've coincided with the trend in some of the ways. Like my Silver Wing books were coming out the same time as the Harry Potter books. So I felt like they probably benefited. I mean, I was writing animal fantasy, but it was probably still, considered fantasy in the general sense. So I felt like I probably enjoyed any kind of trickle-down effect that the Harry Potter phenomenon was creating. And similarly, the Airborne books, you could call them fantasy. They were called steampunk. They were called sci-fi. I feel like all my books are really, basically adventure stories, often with sort of fantastical premises. And I feel like regardless of what's going on in the trends, there's always still a a healthy and appreciative audience for those kind of books. So I feel like I've always written the book I wanted to write, and will continue to do so, and know that there's probably still an audience. It may not be the hottest, biggest audience, and I may not, be eligible for the same kind of awards that I've been lucky enough to rack up in the past, just because people are hungry and looking for different things at the moment, to sort of bring into the spotlight, which is fine. But definitely it changes. I mean, anything changes over 30 years. Any industry, society changes hugely in a 30-year, 25-year period.
Has the actual work of writing for children or teenagers changed over the course of your career?
Not for me. I still go about approaching my stories and the writing of them, and the conception of them and the kind of ideas that I tend to pursue. That really hasn't changed at all. Not in any substantial way. I mean, doubtless, I, like everyone else, am attuned subconsciously to the trends and the zeitgeist, and I can't control that. But I'm not really aware of tailoring my books or trying to chase a trend. I think really the books that I think have been most successful for me are books that I've just written because I wanted to write, and they found an audience. I mean, the closest I came to sort of probably trying to chase a trend was my The Dark Endeavor. That's because I think there was a big Gothic fad and reinvigorated interest in sort of old, the early horror sci-fi characters. I loved Frankenstein, and that idea, I think, of writing about the teenage Victor Frankenstein probably was a little bit market driven.
Rereading your books in advance of our talking, one of the things that occurred to me is it is virtually impossible to associate your work with one genre. Airborne, like you mentioned, reads as fantasy or steampunk. The Silverwing trilogy is very much fantasy. Half Brothers, realistic fiction. Books that comprise The Apprenticeship of Victor Frankenstein are Gothic novels. The Nest, which was published in 2015, is equal parts psychological thriller and horror fiction. What motivates you to cross genres in the way that your work does?
Honestly, I'm not even aware I'm doing it. To me, it's pursuit of a good story. I have notebooks filled with ideas, and whenever I finish a book, I go back and I look at the list of contenders, and I just go with the one I think is the richest and most exciting to me. And when I say they don't seem different to me, it's because I feel like most of my books involve some element of the fantastic intruding into the normal world. Mostly, I think they take place, aside from the Bat books, where it's a bat-centric universe. They take place in a human world, much like our own. But there are some, a few key and critical differences that inform the world and the characters' experiences in it. To me, they're all just good stories.
Well, I wonder if, as you move between genres, does that pose challenges for you? Mm-hmm. Because I could imagine that someone who's consistently writing, say, realist fiction, you become comfortable with that genre. You become comfortable with the workings of the genre. But I wonder, when you're crossing the way that your work does, in a way, you're continually learning to write a new genre.
Mm-hmm. I think it does. I mean, I certainly know from publishers and booksellers, they would prefer if I wrote a certain type of book for a certain audience consistently. That is seen as good business sense. And if I were a better businessman, I probably would have done it. But I'm not a businessman. I'm a writer. So I think, I get it. That if people like, animal fantasy, they might not want to read, maybe they wouldn't read Airborne. It would seem sad to me because I think I try and write really, fun, exciting, engaging stories, regardless of the genre. And to me, it's sort of like the difference between a movie star and a character actor. And when I say character actor, I mean someone who actually can act rather than just has a really good looking physiognomy and a good, relationship with the camera, who plays the same role over and over again in movies, pretty much. Now that's a movie star, and people love it to see that movie star in the same kind of roles, and they'll punish the movie star if they go against the grain. But a real actor, I mean, the whole point of being an actor is you can enter the skin of another human being and become a different person. That's the craft. So I feel like as a writer, I'm just being a writer, and all writers, they might have their own their style, but the voice will change, from book to book as it's appropriate to the story they're trying to tell. So I think, God, if I wrote the same kind of book for the same audience my entire career, I'd feel like, well, I didn't really exercise very much. I didn't really have much of a range. So I plan to keep doing exactly, what I do. Because that's kind of the fun and the challenge of writing, is to sort of enter new territory.
Another thing that I think is really interesting about your books is, regardless of the genre that you're writing in, the story worlds that you construct are just utterly immersive. And I wonder, could you talk about, from your perspective as a writer, what's the role of world building in storytelling?
Well, it can vary in magnitude depending on whether I'm inventing a whole new alternate world for, a different species, like the Silverwing books, in which it was a world seen through the eyes and ears of bats who had their own religion and technology and history. And that is, it's a ton of fun to think about how these creatures inhabit the world and their own myths and journeys, and how they eat and how they organize themselves and migrate. That's a lot of fun. It's also a lot of work. As Airborne, I imagine an alternate past around 1912, the Titanic era. All the social mores are the same. The technology is largely the same, except, airship technology is huge, and there's no need for airplanes. And there's a new ecosystem in the sky and a new element on Earth that allows these airships to be lighter than air. But it's funny because I guess when I said I approach all the books the same, and to me there's a commonality in all the stories, and it is, as you said, it's the sense of an immersive world. Whether it's 1970s BC during a chimp language study, the job of the writer is to put my readers in this place, whatever place it is. And so, the key to doing that, no matter what kind of world it is, whether it's Geneva in the 1800s in Chateau Frankenstein, or a split-level Brady Bunch house in the 1970s, it's got to be seen and experienced through the eyes of a credible character and characters you care about. So often I get asked about world building from aspiring writers, and they imagine a sort of Game of Thrones type response. But you can add as many cool dragons and lore and magic and backstories you want, but none of that matters if you don't have characters who are going about the business of being human and eating breakfast and going to the bathroom and having fights with their siblings and being envious and jealous and dreaming about things and falling in love. Those universal things are kind of the necessary foundation and glue that you need, no matter what world you're in. The world building is kind of like this glorious backdrop, but really at essence, a story is about, a person wanting something and having a lot of trouble getting it.
You mentioned that you enjoy the world building, and I was thinking back, I interviewed Lois Lowry once, and she mentioned that after she wrote The Giver, for years she would get letters, emails from young readers who would say, the character couldn't have passed this because this was here and that building was over here. And she said she really became aware of just how much readers were attending to the worlds that she was constructing in her stories. I wonder, as a writer, when you're approaching world building, what is your process? What challenges does it pose for you?
Well, the challenge is sort of verisimilitude. So, I'm thinking of Airborne, for instance. I knew the era I wanted to set it in. I do a lot of research. I did a lot of research for that book on clothing, men's clothing, women's clothing, technology, social trends, like what else was going on, like the women's suffrage movement, child labor, colonialism, class inequalities. And you just want to make sure all your window dressing is as good as possible, because it forms this, this political and psychological backdrop for your story. So you realize as a writer that details, and often very small details, are very important. Like, how uncomfortable a woman's hat might be, or I don't know, the kind of food you might be eating. Those are sort of little anchor points that constantly remind the reader that, oh, I'm in a different time and this is a different place. It's not like 2018. Because I think especially for young readers, their sense of history can be a little wobbly. The tendency is to think, well, everything is like it is now and always was. So it's, I think, you need to be careful about sort of pointing out the differences. In tangible ways, in very specific ways, and often one very good salient detail, is better than a page of exposition.
You mentioned researching is sort of a front runner to your writing your books, and one of the things that struck me as I was getting ready for our conversation and reading other interviews you've done, reading about your experiences as a writer, you even research for fantasy books, or magical realism. The Boundless, for example. You mentioned you actually took a train all the way across Canada, which I thought was really interesting. You wouldn't think of research for, say, a fantasy genre.
Oh, gosh. I think especially it's necessary for fantasy.
Really?
I think so, because I think fantasy, you need to earn the trust of your reader as soon as possible. And for me, that involves building a foundation of fact and credibility. It's sort of like you're leading someone through this tour, and you want to show them this is real. This is you can trust me.
Right.
This is familiar to you. Yes. This is the house, and here are the rooms, and then you sort of might take them down the through the through the little door in the wall, into the other rooms where unusual things are happening. But if you've sort of earned their trust up front, they're much more likely to come along with you and not roll their eyes and go, "Oh, come on." That would never happen. But if you can convincingly show them, as I said, it's those plausible, believable things. The clothing and there's a motor car on the road, and we're having food, and then don't worry about the cloud cat sailing around in the sky. It's just a totally new species. So I think, yeah, it's built. Every fantasy needs to be built on a good solid foundation of fact, and credible information.
I couldn't help but notice, and I promise I'm not trying to psychoanalyze you here. I couldn't help but notice as I was rereading your books that father-son relationships permeate them. So Matt, the protagonist in Airborne, struggles with the loss of his father. Ben's relationship with his father and half-brother is fraught with tension, as is Steve's in The Nest. In This Dark Endeavor, your adaptation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Victor's forced to confront his father's failings and realize his father has feet of clay. In The Boundless, Will struggles with the fact that his father has a vision of a future for him that's vastly different from the future he imagines for himself. What is it that interests you about that relationship between fathers and sons as a writer?
I think for me, it's just a coming of age moment, I think, where sons and any child really will come to the revelation that their parents are fallible, and possibly capable of malfeasance. If they fail, they'll be weak, and it can be quite a shocking, even a traumatic moment. And to me, there is something particularly, I guess, poignant about father-son relationships, because the father, for the son is sort of the role model, he's going to be the hero, the guiding moral force in his life. So it's just a moment that every child's going to go through. And to me, it's a very interesting moment when you realize the fallibility of your parents and, adults in general, the world in general. You go from a very sort of almost complacent sort of state of mind to one of greater power, because you realize that, you have a little more agency and independence, but there's also an insecurity with it. It's like the airlock door has been blown open, and everything's getting sucked out. Your world's been upended a little bit, but you realize you're also more in control of your own life.
As you're describing those moments of awakening that we have as young people, and as adults as well, when we begin to see darker sides of life or more complicated sides of life, it's not uncommon for you to address those things in your work. And that's certainly the case, I'm thinking, in the Apprenticeship of Victor Frankenstein's series, but it's also the case in other books you've written, including The Nest, which focuses on a young boy who's experiencing, at times, severe anxiety and struggling to deal with the birth of a brother who's extremely ill. And, reading your books, I found myself thinking, I'm not sure if you remember when Megan Cox Gurdon published a piece, I think in 2011 in the Wall Street Journal. It became rather infamous. And in it, she argued that children's books and books for teenagers were overly emphasizing the darker side of life to an extent that she suggested wasn't healthy for young readers. And reading your books, clearly you don't share that viewpoint, because you're very much willing to delve into darker issues or complex issues as needed.
Yeah, I'm not sure I see it as, compared to the possible range of issues that are dealt with in children's and YA books today, I feel like my books are a walk in the park. They're so tame. I don't have any substance abuse problems or self-harm or suicidal, ideation and sexual abuse. So I feel like mine are really still in the realm of sort of just the the quietly personal and even domestic. The Nest is probably the darkest book I've written. But I think I don't see the books as unrelievedly dark, any of my books, because I feel like there's enough sort of joy or humor and sort of life or optimism always balancing it out. I don't feel like I've ever left a reader with a sort of a gut punch ending particularly. Maybe the Stark Endeavor ends on a pretty tragic note. But there is a sequel. So yeah, people talk about, darkness in my books. I guess I've just never really seen it that way. I just see it sort of as a stuff of human nature. But I have always tried, and I hope I'm successful in, as I said, sort of counterbalancing it, because I am not, I would not be happy with sort of an unrelievedly dark psychological landscape, because I just don't think it's fully honest either in most cases. In some books, depending on the subject matter, it may be totally legitimate, but I don't feel like I've ever tackled a subject or a story so heinous that it didn't deserve a counterweight of joy and humor and light.
Yeah, and I definitely don't mean to suggest your books are overly dark, so much as to say you're not afraid to deal with difficult issues in your writing for children. I don't sense that you seem to trust that your readers are going to be able to deal with the issues that you present them with.
Honestly, I'm not sure I deal with anything darker than you could find in a Grimm's fairy tale. I think kids just deal with certain things in a slightly more abstract way than maybe adults do, and perhaps it is because of the nature of the first stories we get, in fairy tales and folk tales, where there's abandonment and loss and murder and dismemberment, and death in no uncertain terms. but it's sort of contained in this shell of story, which makes it more palatable. I mean, as an example, I remember the first time as an adult I read Coraline by Neil Gaiman. I thought, this is terrifying. I mean, the other mother and the button eyes, it was just such a horrific image. This is something from a horror movie. I think, what? Kids are going to be terrified. But I was, telling my wife about the button eyes, and she says, well, kids' toys, their stuffed toys often have button eyes. And I thought, oh yeah, they do, don't they? So maybe the idea of button eyes isn't as horrific for children as it is for me as an adult, because as an adult, I'm imagining eyes being removed and things being sewn into the eye sockets. It is truly horrific. Whereas kids, it's just, oh yeah, it's my toy. It has, those are its eyes. And I'm pretty sure kids, maybe we're not as horrified by Coraline as I was as an adult. I mean, it's a fantastic book. I love the book. But I think kids are quite capable of absorbing that kind of material with perhaps with more ease than adults sometimes think.
I'm interested in the fact that in many of your books, there is or at least as a reader, I perceive that there's a concern with the role that stories play in people's lives. Mm-hmm. So just as an example, in the Apprenticeship of Victor Frankenstein series, Victor has to reconcile himself over the course of both books with stories of his family's past. Mm-hmm. And in The Boundless, Will is continually reminded of the importance of living his own story. And the Silverwings trilogy is particularly interesting in that it's not only concerned with how stories bind people together, but also with the divisive role that stories can play in othering people or marginalizing people. Is this emphasis on story that I'm attributing to your work, is that something that you're cognizant of as a writer?
A little bit. I mean, I think by nature I'm a very skeptical person, and so I think I'm always distrustful of received wisdom to a certain extent. And I think it's important for kids to know, that just because someone tells them something doesn't necessarily mean it's true. I don't mean that in a, to encourage a kind of like, ignorant or frivolous rebelliousness, but a genuine spirit of investigation, I guess. Whether it's, of a personal, your own personal nature, like being told, what kind of person you are, what kind of life you should live. Most of my characters are kind of boundary breakers, Kate DeVries or Rachel Cartland in Every Hidden Thing. I mean, these are people who have to push to get what they want and confound societal expectations. I mean, all my characters tend to be quite spirited and have dreams that they're chasing. And to do that, they have to sort of, break the mold and defy certain, conceptions or preconceptions, which in a way are just other forms of narratives, stories that are told about, how things are. This is just the way things are. And I think, childhood, as I said, one of the great things about writing for kids is it's a time of firsts and boundaries. Kids should be encouraged to, I think, question authority, question what they read, question prevailing notions circulating, in a true spirit of, diversity. Because a lot of the things that, we are told are not right a lot of the time. If you look over history, things that we assumed were right 50 years ago, 100 years ago, for heaven's sakes, they were not right. So I think it's always good to encourage that in kids. And certainly in my life, I feel like, that's just my nature. So this, I'm not saying I'm any great virtuous writer. I'm just saying maybe this is a reflection of my own personal nature. I am skeptical by nature.
You mentioned a couple of times as we've been talking about childhood being a place of pushing boundaries or exploring, testing boundaries. Given that we're celebrating the 200th anniversary of Frankenstein this year, I wanted to take just a minute or two to talk about your adaptation of Mary Shelley's novel in the Apprenticeship of Victor Frankenstein series. I think it's interesting because I've long thought that Gothic is actually a very appropriate genre in many ways for younger readers because it itself is concerned with transgressing boundaries and breaking conventions. You mentioned that you were motivated in part to write that series as you were seeing the Gothic fiction beginning to catch on. Were there other factors that led you to adapt that particular novel?
My genuine love of the novel, for sure. To me, I was always a fan of that novel because it was one of the first Gothic horrors. It was one of the first sci-fi novels, one of the first monster stories, and I love all those. You know, I love creatures. My books are full of creatures and monsters, and unusual animals. And I did have a genuine sort of sense of curiosity about what makes a mad scientist and what Victor Frankenstein would have been like as a teenager. And I wrote down, I had the idea for that book well before I started on it because I wrote down some notes and I felt, I don't know, it just seems like super commercial and trendy right now. It's an origin story of a famous character, and it was quite a dark story. Like I looked at it and I thought, oh man, like it's kind of depressing, and I put it away, for a year and worked on something else, and I mentioned it to my agent, after a year, and he flipped and he said, oh my gosh, yes, like send me the outline for this, and it's the idea, the proposal alone created so much excitement. With publishers and not just North America but worldwide, which is encouraging as to a writer. But it's to me, I guess the other thing that intrigued me is it's basically I saw the series as it's basically the story of failure for Victor. Which is, I think, quite an interesting story for teens. It wasn't a simple hero quest. It was. I saw it as multiple failures, scientifically and moral. It was like the failure of sort of primitive medicine. It was the failure of the occult to solve problems, and even the way I saw it segueing into the original Frankenstein. I mean, is maybe the most problematic of all. It's a success, but it's at what cost? To humanity, and what does it say about our relationship with our, what we unleash in the world, which is like, it couldn't possibly be more topical in 2018. It's 200 years old, but we grapple with these questions every day as technology just accelerates incredibly. I mean, the kind of things that we're on the verge of being able to do as human beings is just a quandary. To me, of just because we can do something, ought we to? Is it really going to add to the aggregate good of society, or might it actually, I don't know, sort of start pulling us apart?
What were the challenges of adapting that book?
Oh, I think the challenge was staying true to the spirit of Mary Shelley's original without alienating modern readers. And in retrospect, I worry that the book is, in terms of the vocabulary and the voice, probably does alienate readers. I don't think most teen readers are really that comfortable, maybe, with that, with the level of the sort of the operatic sort of voice and the vocabulary. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. I just remember going into a school that was very excited to have me visit and talk about the books, and the teacher quickly presented me with I think about a 40-page booklet she'd produced of vocabulary. And her sense of excitement was that I'd introduced the kids to so much new vocabulary. And when I saw the book, at first I was just kind of, I was a bit astounded because, these words, they didn't seem that unusual to me. They seemed pretty run-of-the-mill. But also I was a little bit dismayed that the book had, the main pedagogical use of the book was as a vocabulary introducer to the kids, because I thought that sounds like the least fun thing possible. So things like that made me worry that, the voice of the book was maybe a bit out of reach. So the challenge, I mean, for me as a writer, I wanted to stay true, though, to Mary Shelley's, this sense of her voice. Updating some of the characters was a challenge because in the book, I think, I seem to recall that Victor and Elizabeth are actually related. And apparently, even in one of the earlier drafts, I think they were actually brother and sister. So that, it was an incestuous relationship. But my main problem was Elizabeth in the original. It's funny because it's written by a woman, but she struck me as a rather pale character, and she's certainly not very important, really, to Victor, which may have been the story of Mary Shelley's life. All the men in her life were just like much more interested in other things, much to her sadness. But I wanted Elizabeth to be a strong character, so I like to think I made her more, brought her into the foreground more, and I created a twin brother for Victor, which of course he doesn't have in the original. So those are some of the challenges I think of adapting, and just know you're never going to write a book anywhere near as good as the original.
Were there things you enjoyed about adapting somebody else's work?
Oh yeah, it's great. It's like this huge sort of head start, because you're sort of given this world and you can sort of play with it and reinvent it and take it in a new direction. So that I enjoyed that, and the quest element, the quest structure of the plot was a huge amount of fun. I mean, it's essentially the first one's essentially a treasure hunt for 3 ingredients for the elixir of life, which they're trying to get to cure Victor's sick twin brother. And I love that kind of story. Involves resourcefulness and inventiveness and ingenuity, and that it's a kind of narrative that I find always fun to play with.
And right now you're on an extensive book tour in Canada and soon to be the United States in advance of Inkling coming out, which I believe you said comes out November 5th in the United States?
November 5th, yes.
Could you give people who are listening to the podcast a sense of what the novel's about?
It opens in the middle of the night in the house of a boy called Ethan Rylance, whose dad is a famous graphic novelist, and he's created a very famous graphic novel series called Kren, and he's been stuck for 2 years. He's blocked, and as the story opens, the house cat is prowling through the house and witnesses. It's the only one to witness an incredible event in Mr. Rylance's studio, and his sketchbook. All the drawings on the pages just sort of liquefy and run together into the center of the book into a big ink splotch, and the ink splotch proceeds to yank itself off the pages of the book onto the drafting table, and it is loose in the house, and so there's this sort of blob of inky creativity roaming around the house. And it's like a baby. It sort of teaches itself language through, reading ABC books and then picture books and some math books and novels. And it eats the ink. So it erases the ink as it learns, and it can replicate whatever it's imbibed. And so the ink splotch befriends the boy and helps him with a school project. And as Inkling is discovered by more people in the family and outside the family, everyone has certain uses they foresee for Inkling, some benign and some not so benign. So it's sort of like an episode of Black Mirror for kids. It's it's my version of Stranger Things. So it really is a middle grade adventure romp for me. It's got a lot of joy in it. There's some sadness in the book, but predominantly, I saw it as a very joyful, happy book. Certainly my most humorous book, and its focus is on this small family and the effects of having this magical ink splotch loose in their lives.
That sounds terrific. And again, that'll be available on November 5th in the United States. I wish you the best of luck with your book tour, and thank you so much for taking time out of your life to sit down with me and talk about your work. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk with you.
For me too, Sean. Thank you very much.
And that's our program for this month. Thanks for listening to the Storyteller's Thread podcast. And remember, if you like what you heard, please tell a friend about the program or help spread the word via social media. In the meantime, if you're listening to this program in the U.S., have a happy Thanksgiving. I hope you're able to enjoy time off with family and loved ones, and also that you're able to curl up with a good book. I look forward to seeing you back here next month when we'll continue to celebrate the craft of storytelling. Until then, best wishes.